Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I am here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Well, with the force of Tropical Storm Fiona behind them, the Atlantic coast is looking ahead to challenges and opportunities. Joining us to discuss is Member of Parliament Rick Perkins, who was the Shadow Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard, just being appointed by Pierre Poilievre as the Shadow Minister for Innovation, Science, and Technology. Regardless, welcome to the program, Rick.
Great to be here, Tony.
Great to have you. First of all, love to get your sense of things in Nova Scotia and the other provinces on the Atlantic coast post Fiona. Tell us what you're hearing and what you've observed.
Yeah, it's a challenging time. We're used to hurricanes. In the last 20 years at my house alone, we've had four of them, and you get ready and prepared, but you're not ever totally ready for the aftermath of what happens because you don't know where it's going to come across on landfall and when it's going to do something. And in this case, we had a hurricane that came across in sort of northern mainland Nova Scotia, up around Canso and that area, which impacted Pictou County, Cumberland County, and parts of Cape Breton. And then as it roared across, it had wreaked devastation in PEI, and as we know, in southwest Newfoundland. And so the initial issues were to get power back on. In my case, we lost power for about 6 days, and the main part of the hurricane wasn't with us. We still have people in Nova Scotia and PEI now over 2 weeks from the hurricane that have still not received power. The immediate responsibilities and concerns that I have are deal with our number one issue or our number one industry in Atlantic Canada, which is the fishery. And we have a number of elements of critical infrastructure, the primary one being our wharfs. Uh, Hurricane Fiona impacted what are called small craft harbors. Those are federally managed wharfs and harbors. There's about 180 in the path through the provinces, including Ile de la Madeleine and off the PEI, which is part of Quebec, and southeastern New Brunswick that were impacted. Over 100 of them have been damaged to the point where there's some operational challenges, and over 20 have been completely destroyed. So without that, that's our Trans Canada Highway. So without that, we can't go fishing, and
Mhm.
that's going to be at least a $500 million rebuilding process.
Wow, that extensive. Okay, we're going to talk about infrastructure in a little bit too. I wanted to get your sense just on the immediate concerns. What's taking so long with the power being out for so long?
Well, if you haven't been to Atlantic Canada, you're probably not aware that uh, Nova Scotia is primarily a big rock. Everyone refers to Newfoundland of the rock, but Nova Scotia is a big piece of granite with about 3 inches of dirt on it. So all of our power lines and all of our internet cable lines are all above ground on poles, and we have a lot of trees. And the wind blew them down at a time where the trees had a lot of leaves on them. We had record high winds in this hurricane, and they fall on the power lines. And on my little street of 30 houses alone, there were 40 trees on power lines. So you take that in the more remote houses that you get further up a mile or two up a road, being the only house with power lines and trees down, it takes quite a bit of time to get to them. That's why we call in the army. That's why the premier called in the army in a state of emergency. He requested 1,000 troops, and the federal government only provided half that.
Yeah, and we've got just about a minute left, but let's talk a little bit about the challenges moving forward. So restoring power, restoring the wharves. What else is on your list?
Then analyzing the impact on homes and businesses. A lot of homes aren't insured, so there's going to have to be relief programs for that. Roofs were ripped off. Businesses have had short-term disruption, but there's long-term. Our maple tree business and our forest sector is impacted greatly by the trees. So getting the analysis of that, and in the short term, there are some income loss issues in PEI in southern New Brunswick in the fishery because they were in the midst of the fishing season and now can no longer go out.
And that's still the case.
That's
They're
still
kind
the
of,
case.
yeah, they can't get
Yeah,
their boats
they
out.
can't get out. They lost their gear. They lost at least half their gear, and there's no gear to buy. There's supply chain shortages in just about every industry, including buying lobster traps, and they can't get out and get the gear even if we had millions of dollars for them.
Wow. We're going to return with our guest, Rick Perkins, Member of Parliament for South Shore, St. Margaret's in Nova Scotia. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here with Member of Parliament Rick Perkins. He's the Shadow Minister for Innovation, Science and Technology, formerly Shadow Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard. And it's with that in mind that I'm going to ask you, Rick, just give us a sense of the commercial fishery. I know we talked a little bit about wharves and harbors and stuff, but give us a sense for our audience about the state of it, the good things, the bad things, things that need to be done, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so it depends on the species. Some species in Atlantic Canada is 80% of the value of the Canadian fishery in terms of the commercial fishery. And so whether it's lobster, which is our number one species, to scallops, shrimp, snow crab, these are all important catches that we have that drive the economy in Atlantic Canada and in the Gulf of St. Lawrence into Quebec. Um, those species are in good shape. Some of the species, such as mackerel, herring, some of the other things that we've traditionally caught, are in a low level. Some of that is due to the changing conditions of the ocean. Some of that is due to, in my view, some poor science, and in some cases no science at all by DFO on the state of the stocks. They don't listen to the fishermen about what's actually happening in the water, which is a challenge. So it's if you're into the shellfish industry, it's going very well. We have abundant lobster stocks and the prices are very good. Snow crab has faced a bit of a challenge because Japan was our major exporter, and they broke most of our contracts in the spring and are now buying their crab from Russia.
Mm.
Food is exempt in the war sanctions, and they can get snow crab for a lot less from Russia now because they're desperate for currency. So there's some challenges there. There's a lot of snow crab in the freezer. So we have a lot of bad decisions and inconsistent decisions being made by DFO on both coasts that is impacting the commercial fishery as well. So there's a lot of red tape and a lot of bureaucracy and not a lot of consideration for developing our commercial fisheries.
Yeah, that was I did not know that about the Russians and the snow crab industry, but surely fishers in your riding and throughout Nova Scotia, throughout the Atlantic, would want to open up like new export opportunities. Is there any thought of that, or is there any help from the federal government on that?
It's tough, right? Because eating seafood is either part of your culture or not. It's a big part of the Chinese culture. So, and the U.S. culture. The U.S. is our number one country for exporting seafood. China is very close behind now as they grow in their demand for it. Whereas India, you can't just go into India and create that market since there's not much tradition of eating seafood at the same level that we have in other countries. So, and it's taken probably about 20 years to develop the market in China on seafood, and they particularly shellfish, and they have helped drive the prices up and driven demand up, and which has been good for our industry. So it's challenging. Russia is a competitor. Russia is very big in certain species like northern cod, which we no longer have to fish, and in snow crab. So their economic situation is providing them with a bit of an advantage that we can't match because they're willing to sell it for cost or less at this stage.
Right, right. Fish farms, or is that still a
Yeah,
thing?
yeah. Aquaculture is different on both coasts. The complicated Canadian federation. The federal government's responsible for aquaculture in the West Coast, and there are big decisions that have to be made in the next 2 years by DFO of whether or not they're going to continue to allow more than 100 locations of open net pen farm salmon to go. In Atlantic Canada, it's provincially managed. It's the only thing in the ocean that is provincially managed. So all the provinces are dealing with it differently. There's growing opportunities in Newfoundland for aquaculture because the water is very cold and the bays are very deep, and there isn't a lot of population anymore in some of those coves. Whereas the challenges in Nova Scotia is most of our coast is populated, and most people don't want Atlantic salmon pen farming in their backyard. In New Brunswick, with one of the largest producers globally of farmed salmon being Cook Aquaculture, they're very supportive of it. So it depends on the region. Within Atlantic Canada, there are different views, but it's an important part of feeding the world. The world needs more protein, and farmed salmon is an important part of that solution around the world.
We're speaking with Member of Parliament Rick Perkins, talking about all things Atlantic Canada right now. We'll be back after a few short messages. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom Bust. My guest is Member of Parliament Rick Perkins. He is the MP for South Shore St. Margarets in Nova Scotia, Shadow Minister of Innovation, Science and Technology, formerly Shadow Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard, because we're really focusing in on that. So he's lending us his views because that's part and parcel of being an MP from Nova Scotia for sure. Wanted to get on to a topic we kind of touched upon in the first segment, which is the kind of the infrastructure needs of Atlantic Canada. You talked a little bit about some of the work that has to be done after Fiona, but give us a broader sense of things too. Like generally infrastructure in Atlantic Canada, is it good or bad? Is the federal government a good partner or a poor partner? Give us your point of view on all of this.
So let's separate it between land infrastructure and ocean or commercial fishing infrastructure. In terms of land, um, we could use more. I have the Trans Canada Highway that runs through my riding in the South Shore, and it's only twinned partway through, and it's one of the most dangerous highways in Canada. Has one of the highest levels of accidents and deaths. And so we could use a lot quicker and a lot more support in twinning that highway at least down to the major center in southern Nova Scotia, which is Bridgewater. The province has been asking for that money, been trying to work with it, but there are limited dollars, obviously, to deal with that. So the roads, the TransCanada is not just for the issue of tourism or commuters back and forth. With basically 25% of all seafood in Canada, the value of all seafood coming from two ridings, mine and the one next door, West Nova, the importance of the Trans Canada Highway and moving the trucks and moving that seafood to market is vital. And so the role that the Trans Canada plays is essential. And the fact that it's not twinned provides not only a lot more wear and tear on those roads with the amount of traffic, but it also slows down our access to markets in the US. Those trucks have to go from southern Nova Scotia around and into New England and down to New York. So those are important issues. Some of the infrastructure around highways have been dealt with on the northern part of the province.
Right.
New Brunswick has some wonderful roads now. They've dealt with it through very aggressive over the last 20 years investment by the provincial and federal governments. In terms of the ocean part of our infrastructure, um, we've got obviously issues. The Small Craft Harbors program that funds our highways, the wharfs, has been underfunded for years. It hasn't changed in 12 years. There's only $75 million of federal government money available for 10,000 commercial wharfs in Canada. So the DFO estimate is that southwestern Nova Scotia alone needs $600 million to bring the wharfs just up to operational safety. So it's a big issue, and with um, rising sea levels, which we've had, and our fishermen getting larger and larger boats and going further and further offshore, that causes a big strain on that infrastructure. The other key one, of course, as we know, as all as consumers, is high-speed internet and cell phone service. And in rural Canada, this is still a major issue. Boggles my mind that the infrastructure around cell phones is still an issue. We have large parts of my riding that don't even have decent cell phone service, let alone high-speed internet. And to give you some idea, connecting it back to Fiona and the hurricanes we've had after Hurricane Dorian 3 years ago, the entire cell phone network in Nova Scotia collapsed. It
Wow.
went down. not because it was blown over, but because they're only required to have 6 hours of backup batteries for cell phone towers in Canada. And so when you lose power, and then they go to generators now, and when they don't maintain the generators, you actually lose cell phone service. And we've been losing cell phone service now after these storms, and we've had, as I understand it, a bit of a challenge around the valleys and the hills. In my riding, we lose cell phone service even in good times because when the towers switch to 5G, they have great service, bigger pipe when you have service, but they don't reach as far as the previous generations of cell phone services into the valleys. So we now have large gaps where we have dropped calls. So the government of the day has promised for years uh, better access and more investment in improving our cell phone service. Personally, I believe that that increased competition is the only way you're going to get it. And right now, we don't have that when it comes to the infrastructure for our cell phone service.
Indeed, an age-old problem. We're going to take another quick break. We'll be back with Rick Perkins after that break. So please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Nova Scotia MP Rick Perkins. Rick, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the struggles that Atlantic Canadians are having right now, in particular with the cost of living issues. Maybe just give us your perspective as a local MP on that.
Well, we have all the same issues that I think everyone across the country has with the rising cost of everything. We have probably a lower average level of income, so it impacts perhaps our residents a little more. But on top of that, we have a primary issue. We know energy, fuel, it impacts the cost of everything. And because of the policies of this government and their inability to build pipelines east of Montreal or an unwillingness to get our resources to Tidewater. In Atlantic Canada, we have no choice. We have to heat our homes by oil. We have no natural gas into our homes. So we have to heat it by oil, and that oil comes into St. John, New Brunswick by tanker from Saudi Arabia. Or in the case of electricity, a lot of our electricity is still generated by coal, but it's not even good Nova Scotia coal anymore. And Nova Scotia Power spends $300 million a year importing coal from Colombia to
Wow.
finance fit more than 50% of our energy generation is done by Colombian coal in Nova Scotia. So when you add that cost and then you start talking about imposing a carbon tax, the four Atlantic provinces have not had the Justin Trudeau carbon tax imposed on it because the four Liberal premiers years ago did their own. In the case of Nova Scotia, we have a cap and trade system. The Prime Minister and the Minister of Environment have sent letters this summer saying we have to basically quadruple the cap and trade system limits to keep up with their increasing cost on the price of carbon, or they will impose the carbon tax. So the result of that will be, and the premiers have been fighting that, including the Liberal premier in Newfoundland. And in our case, in Nova Scotia, we put forward a plan to solve the problem with technology, not with taxes. And we've actually led the country. 8 of the 10 provinces have less of their power generated by wind than Nova Scotia does. We have a high amount, and we've got a plan to work with Quebec and others on producing more, getting more hydroelectricity into Nova Scotia. But the government won't listen to that and just wants to impose the carbon tax. Our premier does not want to force that increased cost on consumers at this time. So we may see, in all likelihood, the traditional Justin Trudeau carbon tax imposed on Nova Scotia by April, and that'll add 40 cents a liter by 2030 to fuel in this province. So when you consider the average home heating costs, that's probably on average about $700 more a year per household to heat their home with oil here. And that's just a cost we cannot bear. And that cost will get added to everything else, of course, in our economy from food onwards. And it's a spiral up that the federal government doesn't seem to understand the impacts of. And the sad part of it is that the tax is not actually creating lower carbon emissions. We've had increasing carbon emissions in Canada every year since that tax was imposed.
Wow, you've explained it very well, and thanks for that view of things from Atlantic Canada. Last question for you. We've got about a minute left. Obviously, we've seen an influx of newcomers to Nova Scotia. A lot of Ontarians have moved there because of the housing prices. Is affordable housing an issue with all of this extra demand, or what's going on there?
In my riding across the province, is a huge issue. There is a housing shortage combined with we will love the new people coming here to work and work from home and bring more wealth to our economy, but we don't have the housing to keep up with it, particularly on the lower side of things. And you combine that with the conversion of houses to Airbnbs and tourist things, that's caused a real crunch on housing. So they may not look like big increases in Ontario or in Vancouver, but they are huge increases here. And at the lower end of working Canadians, people who work in the service industry, they're having a hard time finding a place to live, and there's a lot of couch surfing going on. So it's a massive issue throughout Nova Scotia and across the country. And our housing stock is just too limited.
Well, I think we're going to have you back on the program. There's still a lot to discuss, but Rick Perkins, thanks for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
Very interesting discussion with Member of Parliament Rick Perkins from Nova Scotia. Lots of issues from a post Fiona cleanup to the fishery to infrastructure to cost of living, really getting a window on some of the struggles and challenges in Atlantic Canada. Thanks for watching today. We'll see you soon.